Good evening. Tonight we descend into the darkest corner of the botanical world, into a realm where beauty and death intertwine in petals of purple and berries of black. This is not the sanitized version you might find in a textbook. This is the raw, unsettling truth about a plant family that has shaped human civilization for thousands of years, one that has killed emperors, empowered witches, launched medical revolutions, and sparked moral panics across continents. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's step into the shadows. The Shadow Family. The name itself carries weight. Nightshade. It conjures images of darkness, of things that bloom under the cover of shadows, of plants that prefer the company of the moon to the sun. The etymology remains murky, lost in the fog of medieval linguistics, but most scholars believe it refers to the family's preference for shaded places, or perhaps to the nocturnal flowering habits of some species. Others suggest something more sinister, a connection to the shades of the dead, the restless spirits that wandered the twilight spaces between this world and the next. In the cold language of taxonomy, they are Solanaceae, a family encompassing more than 2,600 species spread across every continent save Antarctica. The name derives from Solanum, the type genus, which itself comes from the Latin solemen, meaning comfort or solace. An ironic designation for a family whose members have brought anything but comfort to those who encountered them unprepared. This is a family of profound contradictions. Within its ranks are some of humanity's most essential food crops. The potato, which prevented famine and fed empires. The tomato, now the cornerstone of cuisines worldwide. The pepper, source of both spice and sweetness. The eggplant, staple of Mediterranean tables. Yet alongside these gifts to civilization grow some of the most feared and poisonous plants ever to push through the soil. Belladonna, the beautiful death. Henbane, the witch's herb. Mandrake, the screaming root. Dechira, the devil's trumpet. They are masters of chemical warfare. The alkaloids they produce, nitrogen-rich organic compounds synthesized in their tissues, are among the most potent substances known to affect the human nervous system. Atropine, scopolamine, hyoscyamine, solanine. These molecules, crafted by the plant's metabolism as protection against herbivores and insects, can halt a heartbeat or send a mind spiraling into delirium. They can dilate pupils to wide black pools or slow breathing to a fatal whisper. They can erase memory or create it, vivid and false. The Solanaceae originated in South America, somewhere in the warm lowlands and temperate highlands of that ancient continent. From there, through mechanisms both natural and human-assisted, they spread. Seeds floated across oceans on driftwood. Birds carried them in their digestive tracts, depositing them on distant shores. The wind caught them and bore them over mountains. And humans, always curious and always hungry, carried them deliberately, cultivating the useful and fearing the deadly in equal measure. By the time recorded history begins, nightshades had already woven themselves into the fabric of human culture across the Mediterranean, through the Middle East, and deep into Asia. They were sacred plants and cursed plants. They were medicine and they were murder. They were the tools of healers and the weapons of assassins. In Europe, when it finally encountered the full range of this botanical family, would spend centuries oscillating between worship and terror, unable to decide whether nightshades were gifts from God or temptations from the devil. Ancient whispers, Greece, Rome, and the first poisoners. The ancient world knew nightshades intimately. They appear in the earliest medical texts, in mythology, in the secret recipes of priestesses, and the whispered formulas of poisoners. The Greeks had a word for those who worked with plants for both healing and harm, pharmakoi. It carried no moral judgment, only recognition of skill. A pharmakon could be a cure or a curse, depending on the dose and the intent. Theophrastus, whom later scholars would call the father of botany, wrote around 230 years before the birth of Christ. His treatises on plants cataloged the known world's flora with meticulous care, and among his entries were several nightshades. He recommended mandrake, mandragora in the scientific nomenclature, for treating wounds and gout, for inducing sleep, and, intriguingly, as an ingredient in love potions. The connection between nightshades and altered states of consciousness, between these plants and the realm of the erotic and the ecstatic, was established from the very beginning. Mandrake occupied a particularly strange place in the ancient imagination. The plant's thick, bifurcated root, when pulled from the earth, often resembled the rough shape of a human body, complete with leg-like projections, and sometimes even arm-like branches. This anthropomorphic quality led to the belief that the mandrake was half plant, half human, a creature caught between kingdoms. It was said to grow beneath gallows, sprouting from the earth where the bodily fluids of executed criminals soaked into the soil. Some claimed it was formed from the tears and blood of innocent men wrongly hanged, while others insisted it came from the semen that criminals expelled in the violent spasms of death by strangulation. The legends grew elaborate. It was believed that when pulled from the ground, the mandrake would emit a scream so piercing, so filled with anguish, that any person who heard it would die or go irrevocably mad. Therefore, the proper method of harvest involved tying a rope to the plant and the other end to a dog. The dog, driven forward by hunger for a piece of meat placed just out of reach, would pull the mandrake free. The dog would die from the scream, but the harvester, standing at a safe distance with ears plugged with wax, would survive to claim his prize. Whether anyone actually believed these procedures, or whether they were simply colorful folklore, is lost to history. What is certain is that mandrake root was valued, traded, and used. Its alkaloids, primarily scopolamine and atropine, made it a powerful sedative and analgesic. In controlled doses, it could dull pain, induce sleep, and calm anxiety. In larger doses, it brought hallucinations, delirium, and death. Dioscorides, the Greek physician who served in Nero's army in the 1st century after Christ, compiled a pharmacological work called the Materia Medica that would remain the standard medical reference for over 1,500 years. In it, he described mandrake wine as an anesthetic to be administered before surgery or cautery. This was revolutionary. The agony of pre-modern surgery, the screaming patients held down by strong men while surgeons sawed and cut with no relief from pain, could be mitigated. A patient given mandrake wine would drift into unconsciousness, and the surgeon could work while the body lay still and mercifully unaware. The use of nightshades as poisons was equally ancient. In Greek myth, the witch Circe used them. When Odysseus and his men landed on her island, she served them a meal laced with deadly nightshade. The men, their minds addled by the plant's alkaloids, became docile and confused, and Circe then transformed them into swine. Whether the transformation was literal magic or a metaphorical description of men reduced to base animal behavior by drugs, the message was clear. Nightshades held power over the human mind. The plant was sacred to Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy, the deity whose worship involved altered states and the dissolution of civilized restraint. Worshippers at Dionysian rites would drink wine mixed with nightshade extracts, inducing trances in which they claimed to commune directly with the god. The sensations were intense: euphoria, visual distortions, a feeling of separation from the body, and profound, sometimes terrifying hallucinations. When Rome conquered Greece, it absorbed not just territory but knowledge. Roman physicians studied Greek texts, and Roman aristocrats, always keen for novelty and advantage, sought out the substances that could give them an edge. Nightshades found eager patrons. The elder Pliny, naturalist and admiral, writing in the 1st century, documented numerous nightshades in his encyclopedic natural history. He knew black henbane, which he described as growing wild across the empire. He documented its use in medicine and warned of its dangers. The seeds and roots were particularly potent. Wine infused with the leaves could bring down a fever, he noted, but too much would bring down more than that. Henbane was both remedy and poison, depending entirely on the dose. This was the era when the reputation of nightshades as tools of assassination truly took root. The Roman court was a viper's nest of ambition and intrigue, and poison was the weapon of choice for those who preferred subtlety to the sword. Several emperors were rumored to have fallen victim to nightshade-laced meals. The story of Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus, is particularly persistent. According to historical gossip that hardened into legend, Livia grew tired of waiting for her husband to die of natural causes. She wanted her son Tiberius on the throne, and Augustus, though aging, showed no signs of imminent death. Livia, or so the tale goes, painted the figs growing on Augustus's favorite tree with the juice of Atropa belladonna berries. The emperor, fond of picking and eating the fruit fresh from the branch, consumed enough of the poison to kill him. Livia ensured her own safety by eating only the unpoisoned figs. Tiberius became emperor, and Livia became one of history's most infamous poisoners. Whether the story is true is impossible to verify. What matters is that it was believed. The Romans believed that their empresses and their rivals wielded belladonna as a weapon. The mere possibility shaped behavior, made every meal at court a potential gamble with death. The Empress Agrippina the Younger, wife of Claudius, supposedly hired a professional poisoner named Locusta to kill her husband. Locusta, a woman whose name appears in multiple accounts of suspicious deaths, was said to be an expert in nightshades. She allegedly used belladonna to dispatch Claudius, clearing the way for Agrippina's son Nero to ascend to the purple. Nero, in turn, would later employ Locusta's services against his own enemies. The pattern was set. Nightshades were associated with secrecy, with female power exercised from behind the scenes, with the slow, subtle elimination of obstacles. The Romans knew that a single dose might be survived, its symptoms blamed on spoiled food or natural illness. But a series of small doses, carefully administered over time, would accumulate. The victim would weaken gradually, mysteriously, and when death finally came, it would appear as though fate, not human malice, had intervened. Roman military tactics also employed nightshades. Arrows dipped in a paste made from belladonna, henbane, and other toxic plants could wound an enemy not just physically but neurologically. A soldier struck by such an arrow, even if the wound was minor, would experience confusion, paralysis, and if the dose was right, death. The Romans were pragmatic. If a plant could kill, they would find a way to use it. Yet even as nightshades killed, they also healed. Roman military physicians used mandrake to treat soldiers wounded in battle. A tincture applied to an injury could dull the pain. A small amount drunk before a surgeon extracted an arrowhead or amputated a shattered limb could render the soldier unconscious, sparing him the worst of the agony. The line between medicine and poison was not a line at all. It was a gradient, a matter of measurement and intent. The knowledge of these plants, their properties and their dangers, was preserved in the texts of Galen, physician to emperors and gladiators, whose writings would dominate medical thought for over a millennium. Galen experimented with dosages, cataloged symptoms, and developed preparations that balanced efficacy with safety. He knew that nightshades could relax muscles, slow a racing heart, ease painful cramps. He also knew that a dose only slightly too large could send a patient into convulsions, delirium, and the grave. As Rome fell and its great libraries crumbled or burned, much of this knowledge fragmented and scattered. But it did not die. It moved east, carried by scholars fleeing chaos, preserved in manuscripts that would, in time, make their way back to Europe through a very different culture. The Garden of Hecate, medieval Europe and the witches' herbs. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the light of classical learning dimmed in Europe. The great texts of Galen, Dioscorides, and Pliny were lost to most, existing only in a few isolated monasteries where monks, focused more on salvation than on botany, occasionally copied them. The intricate pharmacological knowledge of the ancient world faded into half-remembered folk remedies and superstition. But the knowledge did not vanish entirely. It was preserved, paradoxically, by the Islamic Golden Age. From the 8th through the 14th centuries, while Europe struggled through what it would later call the Dark Ages, the scholars of Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo were building the House of Wisdom, translating every Greek and Roman text they could find into Arabic, and then improving upon them. Islamic physicians like Al-Razi and Avicenna studied nightshades with scientific rigor. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, completed around the year 1025, contained the most sophisticated analysis of belladonna and its relatives written up to that point. He documented its uses in treating pain, diarrhea, and coughs, noting its particular efficacy in cases of meningitis. He described how it could be used as a sleeping aid, more potent than any other substance available. But he also, critically, described its capacity for addiction, for lethargy, for mental impairment, and for fatal overdose. His work showed that the dose made the poison, a principle that would later be formalized in the Latin phrase sola dosis facit venenum. These Arabic texts would eventually make their way back to Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries, translated into Latin by scholars in Spain and Sicily, places where Christian and Islamic cultures met and, occasionally, collaborated. The knowledge of nightshades returned to Europe, but by then, Europe had developed its own relationship with these plants, one steeped in fear and folklore rather than clinical observation. In medieval Europe, nightshades grew wild in the margins, in disturbed soil near ruined buildings, along shadowed forest paths, in the damp and dark places that sunlight rarely reached. They were not cultivated by respectable farmers. They were gathered by those who lived on the edges of society, the herbalists, the midwives, the cunning folk, and, in the fevered imagination of the times, the witches. The concept of the witch as an agent of the devil, someone who had made a pact with infernal powers in exchange for supernatural abilities, crystallized in Europe during the late Middle Ages. And at the heart of the witch's supposed power were plants, specifically nightshades. The accusation was consistent across thousands of witch trial transcripts, from Scotland to Spain, from Germany to Italy. Witches, it was claimed, used a special ointment or brew made from deadly nightshade, henbane, mandrake, and other toxic plants. This ointment had several alleged purposes. It allowed witches to fly through the air on broomsticks to attend the Black Sabbath, a gathering where they would worship the devil and commit unspeakable acts. It gave them the power to transform into animals. It enabled them to curse their enemies with illness or death, and it allowed them to communicate with demons and spirits. Most of this, of course, was paranoid fantasy, the product of a society gripped by religious fervor and social anxiety. But buried within the hysteria was a kernel of pharmacological truth. Nightshade alkaloids, when absorbed through the skin or mucous membranes, absolutely can cause powerful hallucinations. The recipe for the so-called flying ointment appeared in various forms in demonological texts. A typical formulation, recorded by Andres Laguna, physician to Pope Julius III in the 16th century, included hemlock, deadly nightshade, henbane, and mandrake, all mixed with fat. The fat, often described in lurid detail in confessions extracted under torture as the rendered fat of unbaptized infants, was actually a practical choice. The alkaloids in nightshades are fat-soluble and can be absorbed transdermally, particularly through areas of thin skin or mucous membranes. This is where the image of witches flying on broomsticks may have originated. The ointment could not be ingested. The dose required to cause hallucinogenic effects through the digestive system would likely also cause severe vomiting, seizures, and death. But applied to areas of the body where the skin was thin, the alkaloids could enter the bloodstream in quantities sufficient to produce profound psychoactive effects without killing the user. There are only two areas of the body particularly suitable for this kind of absorption: the armpits and the genitals. Medieval women's clothing, with its layers and tight lacings, would have made applying ointment to the armpits difficult. But the genital area was accessible, and to reach far enough inside the vagina for maximum absorption, an implement was needed. a tool that was readily at hand in any household, a broomstick. This was not metaphor. There is historical evidence supporting this practice. When Lady Alice Keitler was arrested in Ireland in 1324 on charges of witchcraft and the murder of her husband, authorities found in her home a broomstick with a tip coated in a strange, greasy substance. The medieval chronicler Jordanes de Bergamo wrote in the 15th century that he had heard witches confessed, under interrogation, that they would anoint a staff and ride it to their appointed gathering place, or that they would anoint themselves, under the arms, and in other hairy places. The experience of someone using such an ointment would have been extraordinary and terrifying. The tropane alkaloids and nightshades, particularly scopolamine, are classified as deliriants. Unlike psychedelics like psilocybin or LSD, which tend to produce colorful visual distortions and a sense of expanded consciousness, while the user remains aware that they are hallucinating, deliriants cause full-blown delirium. The person cannot distinguish between reality and hallucination. They are convinced that what they are experiencing is real. Common effects included a sensation of flying or floating, a feeling of weightlessness as the drugs affected proprioception and balance. Users reported seeing demons, spirits, and strange creatures. They experienced what felt like travel to distant locations. They believed they were transforming into animals. Time would distort. Minutes could feel like hours, or hours could pass in what seemed like moments. And through it all, there was often a strong erotic component, a sense of overwhelming physical pleasure mixed with the terror. For a person living in medieval Europe, surrounded by a culture that explained everything through the lens of Christian theology, these experiences would not be interpreted as drug-induced hallucinations. They would be understood as literal truth. The woman believed she had flown through the air because, in her mind, she had. She believed she had attended a gathering of witches and demons because, to her subjective experience, she had. When questioned by authorities, she would describe these events as fact, and her questioners, equally convinced of the reality of witchcraft, would believe her. The tragic result was that thousands of people, mostly women, were tortured and executed based on confessions of experiences that were, in reality, nothing more than drug-induced hallucinations. The plants themselves became evidence of demonic activity. If henbane or belladonna was found growing near a person's home, it could be used as evidence of witchcraft. If dried nightshade berries were found among someone's possessions, it was proof they were preparing to harm their neighbors. The association between nightshades and the devil became so strong that the plants acquired new common names that reflected this belief. Belladonna was called devil's berries and devil's herb. Henbane was devil's eye. Datura, a New World nightshade that would later be introduced to Europe, was called devil's trumpet and devil's weed. The plants, through no fault of their own, had been conscripted into a cosmic battle between good and evil. Yet even as nightshades were demonized, they remained essential to medicine. The contradiction was stark but unacknowledged. A monk might grow henbane in the monastery garden for use as a sedative or painkiller, even while his brothers in the church hierarchy were burning women for allegedly using the same plant for witchcraft. A village midwife might use a tincture of belladonna to ease the pain of childbirth, while living in constant fear that if anyone accused her of being a witch, those same healing herbs would become evidence for her execution. The medieval medical use of nightshades was less sophisticated than what the Romans or the Islamic physicians had achieved. Knowledge was fragmented, dosages were imprecise, and the understanding of how the alkaloids worked was primitive. But the plants were still used, still valued, because they worked. A soldier wounded in battle could be given a draught of mandrake wine before the surgeon began his work. A woman suffering from menstrual cramps could find relief in a tea made from henbane. A person racked with the pain of kidney stones could achieve some measure of comfort from belladonna. The herbals of the medieval period, illustrated manuscripts that attempted to catalog medicinal plants, show nightshades prominently. The drawings are often crude, making exact identification difficult, but the text descriptions leave no doubt. These plants were known. They were described. And despite all the fear and superstition, they were used. As Europe transitioned from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, the understanding of nightshades would begin to shift once again. The witch hunts would continue, would in fact intensify in the 16th and 17th centuries, but parallel to the persecution, there would be a renewed interest in classical knowledge, in empirical observation, and in the deliberate, calculated use of these powerful plants for purposes both healing and malevolent. Beautiful death, belladonna, and the Venetian vanity. Of all the nightshades, none has captured the cultural imagination quite like a trope of belladonna. The very name is a masterpiece of nomenclature, layering meaning upon meaning until the plant becomes almost mythological. When Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish naturalist who would revolutionize biological classification in the 18th century, sat down to give this plant its scientific name, he reached back to Greek mythology. Atropos, he named it, after one of the three fates, the Moirai who controlled human destiny. Clotho spun the thread of life. Lachesis measured it out, and Atropos, whose name means the inflexible one, or she who cannot be turned, cut the thread, deciding how and when each mortal would die. It was a fitting name for a plant whose berries could kill a child with just a handful, whose leaves could stop a heart, whose roots contain enough toxin to murder a king. The second part of the name, belladonna, is Italian. It means beautiful woman. And this is where legend and historical reality become difficult to untangle. The common story, repeated in countless books and articles, is that during the Italian Renaissance, particularly in Venice, fashionable women would use drops made from belladonna berries to dilate their pupils. The desired effect was to make their eyes appear larger, darker, more seductive. Wide pupils, after all, are a sign of arousal and attraction, a subconscious signal that the autonomic nervous system uses to indicate interest. A woman with pupils dilated to large black circles would, according to the beauty standards of the time, appear more passionate, more mysterious, more beautiful. The truth, as historians have more recently discovered, is more complicated. The name belladonna does indeed come from the Renaissance Italian for beautiful woman, and there is evidence that some Italian women did use the plant cosmetically. But the primary use appears to have been not for the eyes, but for the complexion. Belladonna extracts were applied to the skin to create a pale, almost luminous effect, the ghostly white complexion that was fashionable among aristocratic women who wanted to distinguish themselves from the sun-darkened skin of peasants who labored outdoors. The association with dilated pupils came later, possibly conflating the cosmetic use with observations of accidental poisonings. When someone consumes even a small amount of belladonna, pupil dilation is one of the most obvious symptoms, occurring long before more severe effects manifest. It's possible that the connection between belladonna and beautiful, large pupils arose from these observations rather than from deliberate use as eye drops. That said, there are accounts, including from physicians of the time, of women using belladonna extracts in their eyes. The practice was dangerous. The drops would indeed dilate the pupils dramatically, creating the wide-eyed look that was considered alluring. But the cost was high. Vision would blur. The ability to focus on close objects would vanish. Light would become painfully bright, requiring the woman to stay in dimly lit rooms or risk severe discomfort. And prolonged use could, as physicians warned, lead to permanent vision damage or even blindness. But vanity has always demanded sacrifice. If enlarged pupils made a woman more desirable to potential suitors, if it gave her an advantage in the complex social chess game of Renaissance courtship, then many women were willing to endure the temporary discomfort and risk the long-term consequences. Beauty, in that world, was currency, and belladonna was a way to mint more of it, even at the cost of one's health. The plant itself is striking. It grows as a branching perennial herb, often reaching heights of 5 to 6 feet, sometimes more. The leaves are large, ovate, and a deep green that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. The flowers are bell-shaped, drooping downward, a dull purple tinged with a sickly yellow-green at the base. They have a faint, unpleasant scent. And then come the berries. The berries of Atropa belladonna are its most dangerous feature. They are roughly the size of cherries, a shiny, lacquered black that gleams invitingly. They grow singly rather than in clusters, each one nestled in a five-pointed calyx that resembles a small crown. Most significantly, they are sweet. This is the plant's cruelest trick. Children, drawn to bright, shiny things, pick the berries and eat them, expecting the sourness of an unripe fruit or the bitterness that often signals poison. Instead, they taste pleasant, almost like a sweet cherry. A child who eats 3 to 5 belladonna berries will likely die. An adult might survive 10, depending on their size and constitution, but they will suffer terribly in the process. The symptoms begin with dry mouth and difficulty swallowing, as the alkaloids inhibit salivation. Then comes pupil dilation, light sensitivity, and blurred vision. The heart begins to race. Body temperature rises, sometimes to dangerous levels, and the skin becomes hot and dry. Confusion sets in, followed by hallucinations. The victim might become agitated, violent, trying to flee from imaginary threats. Or they might become lethargic, slipping into a coma. Eventually, if the dose is high enough, the heart fails or breathing stops. Throughout European history, belladonna's berries claimed victims, particularly children. Parish records from medieval and early modern England contain numerous entries noting the death of children who ate devil's cherries, or deathberries, common names for belladonna. The plant grew wild in waste places, in the ruins of old buildings, along shaded lanes. It was ubiquitous and deadly. And yet, under controlled conditions, the same alkaloids that killed could heal. The primary compound in belladonna is atropine, named after Atropos, just as the plant itself was. In 1831, a German pharmacist named Heinrich Main succeeded in isolating atropine in pure crystalline form. This was a watershed moment. For the first time, physicians could administer precise doses of the active compound rather than relying on crude plant extracts whose potency varied wildly depending on growing conditions, harvest time, and preparation methods. Atropine revolutionized several fields of medicine. In ophthalmology, it became essential. A few drops of dilute atropine solution in the eye would dilate the pupil fully, allowing doctors to examine the interior of the eye, the retina, and the optic nerve. Surgeons performing delicate eye operations could use it to paralyze the muscles that controlled pupil constriction, giving them an unobstructed view of their work. The effect, unlike the brief dilation produced by more modern drugs, could last for days, even weeks, giving the eye time to heal after surgery or injury. In emergency medicine, atropine became a life-saving drug. It can counteract certain types of poisoning, particularly from organophosphate insecticides and nerve agents. These toxins work by inhibiting the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter. The result is an overstimulation of the parasympathetic nervous system, excessive salivation, tears, bronchial secretions, slowed heart rate, and eventually respiratory failure. Atropine, as an anticholinergic, blocks the receptors that acetylcholine would normally bind to, counteracting the poison's effects. Farmers who accidentally exposed themselves to certain pesticides could be saved by an injection of atropine. Soldiers exposed to nerve gas could survive if atropine was administered quickly enough. During surgery, atropine found another use. General anesthesia, particularly in the early days of ether and chloroform, could cause excessive salivation and bronchial secretions that endangered the unconscious patient. A dose of atropine before surgery would dry these secretions, making the procedure safer. It also helped prevent the dangerous slowing of the heart that could occur when certain areas of the body were manipulated during surgery. The plant that had been the instrument of medieval witches and Renaissance poisoners had become an essential tool of modern medicine. The transition is emblematic of nightshades as a whole. The line between poison and cure is not a matter of the substance itself, but of the knowledge, intent, and precision with which it is used. Even today, belladonna and its derivatives remain in use. Atropine is on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. Eye doctors still use it, though less frequently than in the past, preferring shorter-acting alternatives for routine exams. Emergency medical technicians carry it in their kits. Military forces stockpile it as an antidote to chemical weapons. The beautiful woman, the inflexible one who cuts the thread of life, continues to serve humanity, now wielded by those who understand her true nature. The sorcerer's toolkit, henbane and mandrake in myth and medicine. If belladonna was the dark queen of nightshades, then henbane was her sinister minister, and mandrake the strange, screaming familiar lurking in the shadows. These two plants, close cousins in the Solanaceae family, carved out their own niches in European consciousness, each with its own elaborate mythology and practical applications. Henbane, Hyacinthus niger, goes by many names: black henbane, stinking nightshade, devil's eye, the witch's plant. The name, henbane, itself dates to the year 1265, with bane meaning death or poison. Chickens, it was observed, would not eat the plant, an unusual abstinence given that fowl will generally peck at almost anything green. Some etymologists trace the name to Indo-European roots meaning crazy plant, while others connect it to Proto-Germanic words for vision, hallucination, and magical power. The plant is hairy and sticky to the touch, covered in glandular trichomes that secrete a resinous substance with a distinctly unpleasant odor. The flowers are pale yellow or cream-colored with purple veins radiating from a dark, almost black center, giving them an eerie, eye-like appearance. The seed pods, when mature, resemble a row of grinning teeth protruding from the plant stalk. Everything about henbane's appearance suggests something not quite right, something that belongs to a nighttime world rather than the cheerful day. Henbane's psychoactive properties are intense. The plant contains 3 primary alkaloids: scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine, with scopolamine being the most concentrated and the most powerfully hallucinogenic. The effects have been recorded throughout history, with a mixture of fascination and horror. In 1966, the German writer Gustav Schenk described his experience after intentionally inhaling the smoke of burning henbane seeds. "My teeth were clenched and a dizzy rage took possession of me," he wrote. "I was permeated by a peculiar sense of well-being connected with the crazy sensation that my feet were growing lighter, expanding and breaking loose from my body. Each part of my body seemed to be going off on its own, and I was seized with the fear that I was falling apart. At the same time, I experienced an intoxicating sensation of flying. I soared where my hallucinations were swirling along: clouds, the lowering sky, herds of beasts, falling leaves, billowing streamers of steam, and rivers of molten metal. The sensation of flying was consistent across reports. This was not metaphorical. Users genuinely felt as though they were weightless, floating, soaring through the air. This experience, combined with the total conviction that the hallucinations were real, may have contributed to the medieval accounts of witches flying to their Sabbaths. They believed they flew because, from their perspective, under the influence of henbane, they did fly. The ancient Greeks knew henbane well. The priestesses at the Oracle of Delphi, the Pythia who pronounced prophecies in cryptic verses while seated on a tripod above a crack in the earth, were said to breathe the smoke of burning henbane to enter their prophetic trances. Whether this was supplemented by other intoxicants, or by natural gases seeping from the geological fault below the temple, remains a subject of scholarly debate. But henbane was certainly part of the temple's pharmacopoeia. In the centuries that followed, henbane became inseparable from witchcraft. A medieval document from a Pomeranian trial in 1538 recorded a woman's confession that she had given a man henbane seeds to make him run around crazy, which in the context likely meant sexually aroused, as henbane was believed to be a powerful aphrodisiac in small doses. An Inquisition file noted that a witch had scattered henbane seeds between 2 lovers while chanting a formula to make them hate and avoid each other until the seeds were found and separated. Henbane was also used, often more successfully than these supposed love magics, as a medicine. It was a powerful sedative and analgesic. Smoke from burning henbane seeds could ease respiratory complaints, though inhaling too much could lead to more than relief. Oil extracted from the plant could be rubbed into aching joints and muscles. A tincture could calm violent mania or induce sleep in those tormented by insomnia. The dose, as always, was critical. Too little, and the medicine had no effect. Too much, and the patient would slip from sedation into delirium, from pain relief into convulsions and death. The deaths, when they occurred, were particularly gruesome. Accounts describe victims seized by violent spasms, their bodies contorted by uncontrollable muscle contractions, their faces frozen in grimaces of agony. It was a horrific way to die, and the fear of henbane poisoning added to the plant's dark reputation. Even Cleopatra, according to some accounts, considered using henbane as a method of suicide. She had her servants test it, and when she saw how they died, she was appalled and chose a different method. Whether this story is historical fact or later embellishment is uncertain, but it illustrates the deep-seated association between henbane and violent, unpleasant death. If henbane was feared, mandrake was both feared and revered in equal measure. The legends surrounding Mandragora officinarum are among the most elaborate in all of botanical folklore. The plant's root, thick and often divided into leg-like projections, sometimes with smaller branches resembling arms, gave rise to the belief that mandrake was not entirely plant, but something in between, a creature that lived in the soil and screamed when disturbed. The screaming mandrake appears in texts across medieval and Renaissance Europe. John Donne wrote of it. Shakespeare referenced it. The procedure for harvesting it became codified. Dig around the plant to expose the root, tie a rope to it and to a dog, place meat or food just beyond the dog's reach, plug your ears with wax, and retreat to a safe distance. The starving dog, lunging for the food, would pull the mandrake free. The plant scream would kill the dog, but the harvester would survive. Why would anyone go to such lengths? Because mandrake root was valuable. It was used as a powerful sedative and anesthetic. Medieval surgeons used mandrake wine to render patients unconscious before operations. A concoction called the soporific sponge, created by soaking a sea sponge in a mixture of mandrake, opium, henbane, and other substances, could be held to a patient's face, allowing them to inhale the vapors until they lost consciousness. Mandrake was also believed to have aphrodisiac properties. It appeared in recipes for love potions across Europe. Young couples hoping to conceive would drink wine infused with small amounts of mandrake root. Whether it worked is questionable, but the belief persisted. The plant was also thought to have talismanic properties. A mandrake root, properly harvested and preserved, was believed to bring wealth, good fortune, and protection. King Solomon, according to legend, wore a seal ring containing a piece of mandrake root, which gave him power over spirits and demons. Alchemists sought mandrake for their work. Magicians considered it essential. Even practical, hard-headed merchants would pay high prices for a good mandrake root, convinced it would bring prosperity to their business. The reality of mandrake's effects was less mystical, but no less significant. Like belladonna and henbane, mandrake contains tropane alkaloids, primarily scopolamine and hyoscyamine. These compounds have genuine pharmacological effects. They can induce sedation, cause hallucinations, relieve pain, and in sufficient doses kill. The medieval combination of mandrake, opium, henbane, and sometimes other substances created a genuinely effective anesthetic. A patient given the soporific sponge would fall unconscious, allowing surgeons to perform procedures that would otherwise have been impossible due to the patient's agony and struggles. This was a major advancement in medieval medicine, even if the practitioners did not fully understand the mechanisms at work. As scientific understanding advanced, the mystical aspects of mandrake faded, but the medical applications persisted into the modern era. In the early 1900s, a mixture of morphine and scopolamine was used in a procedure called twilight sleep, administered to women during childbirth. The idea was that the combination would allow the woman to endure labor without pain and without memory of the ordeal. The The practice was eventually abandoned due to concerns about the health of newborns and complaints from mothers who found the experience of having no memory of their child's birth deeply disturbing. Today, scopolamine, the primary alkaloid in mandrake and henbane, is still used medically, most commonly for motion sickness. The transdermal patch placed behind the ear before a sea voyage or a long car trip contains scopolamine, a direct descendant of the ancient preparations that priestesses inhaled at Delphi and that witches allegedly rubbed into their skin. The plant that once screamed in legends now works silently, a precisely measured dose delivered through modern pharmaceutical technology, but still the same molecule, still extracted or synthesized from the chemical blueprint provided by a nightshade plant. The poison courts, Renaissance Italy, and the art of murder. As Europe emerged from the Middle Ages into the bright, brutal daylight of the Renaissance, nightshades found a new arena in which to demonstrate their power: the courts of Italy. This was the age of the Borgias, the Medici, and a host of lesser families whose ambition outstripped their morality. Political murder became not just common, but almost expected, a tool of statecraft as accepted as diplomacy or war. And poison was the weapon of choice. The reasons were practical. A man stabbed in the street or shot with an arquebus prompted an investigation, a search for the killer, a potential blood feud that could destabilize alliances. A man who sickened and died after a banquet could plausibly have succumbed to natural causes. Food spoiled easily in an era without refrigeration. Fevers and mysterious ailments were common. If the poison was chosen well and administered skillfully, the death would look like nothing more than bad luck. Nightshades, with their cardiovascular and neurological effects, were perfect for this purpose. The symptoms could mimic various natural diseases. A victim given a carefully measured dose of belladonna might appear to die of a heart attack, their pulse racing to a fatal rhythm before stopping entirely. Someone fed a preparation of henbane could seem to succumb to a fever, their body hot and dry, their mind wandering in delirium until they slipped into unconsciousness and death. The Borgia family, originally from Valencia in Spain, became the most infamous poisoners of the era. Whether they deserve this reputation is debated by modern historians, who note that many of the accusations come from the propaganda of their enemies and from later legends that grew in the telling. But contemporary accounts and the sheer number of suspicious deaths surrounding the family suggest that where there was smoke, there was probably also some fire, or at the very least, some poison. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, held the papacy from 1492 until 1503. During his reign, several cardinals who opposed him or who possessed significant wealth died suddenly and conveniently. The rumor was that Alexander had them poisoned and then seized their property to fund his lavish lifestyle and his military campaigns. Whether he personally ordered these deaths or whether they were simply opportune coincidences exploited for financial gain is impossible to prove, but the whispers persisted. The poison allegedly used by the Borgias was called cantarella. The name might derive from the Latin word for a small cup, referencing how it was often mixed into wine or a liqueur and served in small vessels. Alternatively, it might come from cantharides, the Spanish fly insect that secretes the substance cantharidin, a powerful irritant and supposed aphrodisiac that can cause excruciating death if taken in even moderately large amounts. The exact composition of cantarella remains unknown. Most historians believe it was based on arsenic, a metalloid that was widely available and that could be prepared in various forms with different levels of toxicity. Arsenic trioxide, known as white arsenic, was odorless, tasteless, and could be easily dissolved in wine. It was, in many ways, the perfect poison. But some sources suggest cantarella was a mixture, potentially containing arsenic along with nightshade extracts and other toxins, creating a compound whose effects would be difficult for any physician to diagnose. Cesare Borgia, Alexander VI's illegitimate son, was more ruthless than his father and less concerned with maintaining appearances. Most of his enemies died by more direct methods: strangling, stabbing, drowning. But he was said to carry a poison ring, a piece of jewelry with a hidden compartment containing powder toxin. A simple handshake with the ring positioned correctly could deliver a fatal dose through a tiny scratch in the victim's palm, an assassination method elegant in its simplicity and difficult to detect. The Medici family of Florence, while less notorious than the Borgias, also had their share of poisoning scandals. Catherine de' Medici, who became Queen of France in the 16th century, was rumored to maintain a cabinet of poisons, a collection of carefully labeled vials and powders that she could deploy against those who threatened her position or her children's claims to the throne. She was known to consult with astrologers, alchemists, and individuals with knowledge of toxic substances. Whether she actually poisoned anyone remains unproven, but the rumors followed her throughout her life and after her death. One prominent Medici, Ippolito de' Medici, died in 1535 under suspicious circumstances. He had been in conflict with Alessandro de' Medici, the Duke of Florence, over control of the city. Ippolito fell ill suddenly during a trip and died within days. An autopsy suggested poison, though the details are disputed. Alessandro was widely believed to have ordered the murder, though nothing was ever proven. The prevalence of poisoning, real or imagined, created an atmosphere of paranoia in Renaissance courts. Nobles employed food tasters, servants whose job was to sample every dish before it was presented to their master. If the taster fell ill or died, the meal was discarded. Some rulers developed elaborate rituals around meals, with dishes prepared in locked kitchens under guard, served on special plates believed to detect poison, and eaten only after multiple people had tested each course. The belief that certain materials could detect poison was widespread. Unicorn horn, actually the tusk of a narwhal, was thought to sweat or change color in the presence of toxins. Plates made from particular stones or metals were said to do the same. None of this actually worked, but the belief was so strong that noblemen paid fortunes for these supposed safeguards. The reality was grimmer. In an age before chemical analysis, before anyone understood the molecular structure of alkaloids or the mechanisms by which they affected the body, detecting poison in food or drink was nearly impossible. A skilled poisoner who understood dosage and timing could kill with impunity, and many did. The fear of poison shaped behavior. Alliances were fragile because no one knew who might decide that eliminating a rival or a troublesome ally was worth the risk. Marriages were arranged not just for political advantage, but also with an eye toward which family was less likely to poison their in-laws. Trust became a rare commodity, and with good reason. Italy was not alone in this. The phenomenon of political poisoning spread across Europe. In France, the 17th century saw the Affair of the Poisons, a scandal that rocked the court of Louis XIV. Hundreds of people, many of them aristocratic women, were implicated in a network of fortune-tellers, alchemists, and poisoners who sold their services to those seeking to dispose of inconvenient spouses, rivals, or relatives whose inheritances were desired. The primary poison in the Affair of the Poisons was arsenic, but nightshade extracts were also implicated. The case revealed the extent to which poison had become a tool of domestic policy among the wealthy. It was not just kings eliminating political enemies. It was wives disposing of abusive husbands, mistresses removing rivals, and heirs hastening their inheritances. Nightshades, with their long history and their complex, multi-system effects, were ideal for these purposes. A wife could add small amounts of belladonna to her husband's wine over weeks or months, slowly weakening him until he died of what appeared to be natural causes. A rival could be given a meal laced with henbane, inducing a madness that would make them appear mentally unfit, discrediting them without the need for outright murder. The knowledge of how to prepare and administer these poisons was carefully guarded and passed down through networks of practitioners. Some were genuine herbalists and healers who also understood the darker applications of their craft. Others were charlatans who sold ineffective or overly potent mixtures and relied on their clients' ignorance. And some were true experts, like Giulia Tofana, an Italian woman who allegedly poisoned over 600 people using a solution called aqua tofana, which may have contained belladonna or other nightshade alkaloids along with arsenic and lead. The Renaissance fascination with poison eventually waned, not because people became more moral, but because detection methods improved. By the 19th century, chemists had developed tests that could identify arsenic in a corpse or in food. The Marsh test, invented in 1836, was sensitive enough to detect tiny amounts of arsenic, making it much riskier to use the poison without being caught. As science advanced, the age of casual poisoning ended. But the legacy of Renaissance poison culture persisted in the cultural imagination. The Borgias became synonymous with treachery and poison. The very name conjures images of shadowed rooms, goblets of wine laced with death, and political murders disguised as natural ends. And at the heart of many of those whispered stories, whether factual or embellished, were the nightshades, the plants that had given poison its power since ancient times. The Solanaceous invasion, New World nightshades come to Europe. While Europeans were simultaneously fearing and exploiting their native nightshades, an entirely different branch of the Solanaceae family was growing in the Americas, plants that indigenous peoples have been cultivating for thousands of years. When Christopher Columbus returned from his first voyage in 1492, he brought with him reports of strange new plants. In subsequent expeditions by Spanish and Portuguese explorers, seeds and specimens made the journey across the Atlantic. Among them were nightshades that would, in time, transform European cuisine, agriculture, and eventually the world economy. But first, they had to overcome a deep and abiding fear. The tomato, Solanum lycopersicum, arrived in Europe in the early 1500s, probably through Spain. Spanish conquistadors had observed the Aztecs cultivating and eating what they called tomatal, a fruit that grew in various sizes and colors on bushy plants. The Spaniards brought seeds back with them, and the plant began to spread through Mediterranean Europe. In 1544, an Italian herbalist named Pietro Andrea Mattioli published the first European description of the tomato. He classified it as a type of mandrake and a nightshade, which immediately gave it a problematic reputation. Mandrake, as we've established, was associated with both medicine and witchcraft. Nightshade meant poison. Mattioli noted that the plant was eaten in Italy, prepared similarly to eggplant, but his classification colored how other Europeans viewed it for centuries. The tomato's resemblance to belladonna did it no favors. Both plants produce small fruits on similar-looking vines. Belladonna's berries are black when ripe, but before they mature, they go through various color stages including green and yellow, colors that tomatoes also display. To an observer unfamiliar with the plants, the similarity could be alarming. If one nightshade was deadly, why should this one be safe? There is a persistent legend about why tomatoes were feared in Europe for nearly 2 centuries. The story claims that wealthy Europeans began dying after eating tomatoes, leading to the fruit being dubbed the poison apple. The explanation given is that these aristocrats ate tomatoes off pewter plates, which had a high lead content. The acidity of the tomato would leach lead from the plate, and the diners would succumb to lead poisoning. The tomato, being present at the scene, was blamed. This story has been widely repeated, but modern food scientists are skeptical. The amount of lead that would leach from a pewter plate during a single meal, even with acidic tomato sauce, would be insufficient to cause acute poisoning. Lead poisoning from tableware is a cumulative issue, not something that would kill someone after one dinner. A more likely explanation for the fear of tomatoes is simply their botanical family. They were nightshades. The leaves and stems of tomato plants do contain toxic alkaloids, solanine and tomatine, which can cause illness if ingested in quantity. The fruit itself contains these alkaloids only in trace amounts when ripe, amounts far too small to harm anyone. But this distinction was not understood at the time. If the plant's leaves were poisonous, many reasoned, then the fruit must be as well, or at least potentially so. The tomato also arrived in Europe during a period of heightened anxiety about new things. This was the era of the witch trials, of religious warfare, of deep suspicion toward anything unfamiliar. A plant from the New World, a land associated with savagery and paganism in the European mind, was inherently suspect. That it resembled a plant used by witches in their foul practices only made it more so. For over 200 years, tomatoes were grown in Europe primarily as ornamental plants. They were called love apples, perhaps because of Mattioli's comparison to mandrake, which was considered an aphrodisiac. People grew them in their gardens for their attractive red or yellow fruits, but few dared to eat them. The breakthrough came slowly. In Spain and southern Italy, where the climate was closest to the tomato's native habitat, and where people were perhaps more willing to trust their own observations over received wisdom, tomatoes began to be eaten. By the late 1600s, recipes using tomatoes appeared in Spanish and Italian cookbooks. They were cooked with oil and chili peppers, methods borrowed from the Aztec preparation that the conquistadors had observed. The transformation from ornamental curiosity to food staple had begun, but it would take another century before the rest of Europe and North America fully accepted the tomato. In America, the tomato faced similar suspicion. When it arrived in the British North American colonies, probably around 1610, it was grown but rarely eaten. Thomas Jefferson, the third president and an avid botanist, cultivated tomatoes at Monticello, but there's no clear evidence that he ate them regularly. Even by the 1820s, tomatoes were still viewed with caution in much of the United States. A legend, almost certainly apocryphal, tells of Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson eating a basket of tomatoes on the courthouse steps in Salem, New Jersey, in 1820, while a crowd gathered to watch him die from the poison. When he survived, the story goes, the crowd was convinced that tomatoes were safe. Whether this event actually occurred is doubtful. The first mention of it appears in a 1937 book by a local historian with no earlier documentation. But the story illustrates the cultural memory of how frightening tomatoes once were. What finally convinced Americans to eat tomatoes was the Civil War and the rise of the canning industry. Tomatoes could be canned easily and stored for long periods, making them ideal for feeding armies and urban populations. Canned tomatoes became a staple, and once people became accustomed to eating them in this form, fresh tomatoes became acceptable as well. By the late 19th century, tomatoes were everywhere in American cuisine, the fear of nightshades finally overcome by practicality and profit. The potato, Solanum tuberosum, faced a similar journey, though with different obstacles. Native to the highlands of South America, where the Inca had cultivated it for thousands of years, the potato arrived in Spain around 1570. Unlike the tomato, the edible part of the potato is not even visible above ground. The plant produces tubers, modified stems that grow beneath the soil and store energy in the form of starch. Europeans initially did not understand what part of the plant to eat. Some tried the small fruits that grew on the stems above ground, which are toxic, containing high levels of solanine. Others ate the leaves, which are also poisonous. The resulting illnesses confirmed that potatoes were nightshades and therefore dangerous. Early reports described potatoes as causing leprosy, or as being associated with the devil, or as having various disturbing properties. Eventually, someone figured out that the tubers were the edible part. But even then, acceptance was slow. The potato was viewed as food fit only for livestock or the desperately poor. It was suspected of causing various diseases. It was alien, coming from the same new world that had brought syphilis and other plagues. What changed minds was famine. In Ireland, the climate and soil were poorly suited to growing wheat, the preferred grain. But potatoes thrived in Irish conditions. A single acre planted with potatoes could feed far more people than an acre of wheat. Irish peasants, facing chronic food shortages, began planting potatoes extensively in the 17th and 18th centuries. The plant went from suspect foreign import to national staple. The Irish example eventually convinced the rest of Europe. Prussia, facing food shortages during wars, mandated potato cultivation. France followed suit. By the 19th century, potatoes had become one of the most important crops in Europe, second only to wheat in acreage and exceeding it in total caloric production. But potatoes remain nightshades, and they carried a hidden danger that would reveal itself catastrophically. The tubers are safe to eat when properly prepared, but they must not be exposed to light, which causes them to produce chlorophyll and increase their levels of solanine and chalconine, toxic alkaloids. Green potatoes, or potatoes with sprouts, contain enough of these toxins to cause serious illness. Moreover, the potato plant is vulnerable to a fungal disease called late blight, caused by Phytophthora infestans. In the 1840s, this pathogen swept through Europe's potato fields. In Ireland, where much of the population depended on potatoes as their primary food source, the result was the Great Famine. Over 1 million people died from starvation and disease. Another 1 million emigrated, many to America. The event shaped Irish history and the Irish diaspora for generations. The irony is bitter. Europeans had feared nightshades for centuries, associating them with poison and death. They had burned women as witches for using belladonna and henbane. They had avoided tomatoes for 200 years out of fear. And then they adopted the potato so completely, so unquestioningly, that when the crop failed, 1 million people died. The nightshade they had feared less turned out to be the one that killed the most. Other New World nightshades also made the journey to Europe, though with less dramatic effect. Peppers, capsicum species, were embraced more quickly because they were obviously not poisonous, merely painfully spicy. Tobacco, Nicotiana tabacum, another nightshade, became a global commodity, though its health effects would take centuries to be fully understood. Datura species, particularly Datura stramonium, known as Jimson weed or devil's trumpet, spread as weeds and were both used medicinally and feared for their powerful hallucinogenic and toxic properties. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Old and New Worlds, fundamentally altered both hemispheres. The nightshade family was central to this transformation. Europe gave the Americas belladonna, henbane, and mandrake, plants of medicine and magic. The Americas gave Europe tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, and tobacco, plants that would reshape diets, economies, and in the case of tobacco, public health for centuries to come. By the end of the 19th century, nightshades were everywhere. The tomato had become the foundation of Italian cuisine, so completely integrated that many Italians believed it had always been there. The potato had saved some populations from starvation and condemned others when it failed. Peppers had become essential to cuisines from Hungary to Thailand. And tobacco had become a global addiction, its connection to the deadly nightshades, all but forgotten by those who smoked it. The great fear of nightshades had not disappeared, but it had been compartmentalized. Belladonna and henbane were still dangerous, still associated with witchcraft and poison in the popular imagination. But tomatoes and potatoes were just food. The family had split in the cultural consciousness, divided into the safe and the deadly, even though chemically, they were all producing the same basic types of alkaloids, just in different quantities and distributions within the plant. The chemistry of nightmares, understanding tropane alkaloids. For thousands of years, humans used nightshades without understanding how they worked. They knew that belladonna could dilate pupils, that henbane could induce visions, that mandrake could render a patient unconscious. But the mechanism, the actual molecular reason why these plants affected the human body in such profound and specific ways, remained unknown. The breakthrough began in the early 19th century, as chemistry emerged as a rigorous science. Researchers had begun isolating pure compounds from plants, extracting the active ingredients that gave each plant its particular properties. In 1804, morphine was isolated from opium poppies, the first alkaloid to be purified. This opened the floodgates. Chemists realized that many of the most pharmacologically active plants owed their effects to alkaloids, organic compounds containing nitrogen. In 1819, German chemists isolated an alkaloid from coffee beans and named it caffeine. In 1820, quinine was extracted from cinchona bark. And in 1831, as mentioned earlier, Heinrich F. G. Main succeeded in isolating atropine from Atropa belladonna in pure crystalline form. Atropine, and its close relatives scopolamine and hyoscyamine, belong to a class of alkaloids called tropanes. The name comes from tropine, the core structure around which these molecules are built. All tropane alkaloids share certain structural similarities and, consequently, certain effects on the human body. These molecules work by interfering with the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. In the human nervous system, acetylcholine is released at nerve endings to transmit signals. It binds to specific receptors on the surface of cells, triggering responses. There are two main types of acetylcholine receptors: nicotinic and muscarinic. Tropane alkaloids like atropine and scopolamine are muscarinic antagonists, meaning they block muscarinic receptors, preventing acetylcholine from binding and thus interrupting the signal. This is why nightshade poisoning produces such specific symptoms. The parasympathetic nervous system, which uses acetylcholine extensively, controls functions like salivation, sweating, digestion, pupil constriction, and heart rate. When atropine blocks the muscarinic receptors, these functions are disrupted. Salivary glands stop secreting, causing dry mouth. Sweat glands shut down, leading to hot, dry skin and potentially dangerous increases in body temperature. The pupils dilate because the muscles that constrict them can no longer receive the acetylcholine signal. The heart rate increases because the normal parasympathetic brake on heart activity is removed. Digestion slows or stops, causing constipation. In the brain, where acetylcholine is also a major neurotransmitter, the blockage causes confusion, memory impairment, hallucinations, and delirium. The difference between atropine and scopolamine is largely one of degree and distribution. Both block muscarinic receptors, but scopolamine crosses the blood-brain barrier more easily and has a stronger effect on the central nervous system. This is why scopolamine is more likely to cause hallucinations and profound delirium, while atropine's effects are more pronounced in the peripheral nervous system. Hyoscyamine is interesting because it exists as two mirror image forms, called enantiomers. The levo form, L-hyoscyamine, is the one found naturally in plants. When extracted and purified, it tends to convert to a mixture of both forms, called racemic hyoscyamine, which is chemically identical to atropine. So atropine, technically, is the racemized form of hyoscyamine. The medicinal uses of these alkaloids all stem from their anticholinergic properties. Atropine is used to speed up a dangerously slow heart by blocking the parasympathetic signals that normally keep heart rate low. It's used during surgery to prevent excessive salivation and bronchial secretions, which could be aspirated into the lungs of an unconscious patient. Doctors use it to paralyze the muscles that control the pupil and the lens, allowing for detailed examination of the eye's interior and giving the eye time to heal after surgery. Scopolamine is used primarily for motion sickness. The drug, delivered through a patch placed behind the ear, prevents the nausea and vomiting that occur when the brain receives conflicting signals from the eyes and the inner ear balance system. It does this by blocking muscarinic receptors in the vestibular system and the brain regions responsible for triggering nausea. Both atropine and scopolamine have been used, experimentally, as rapid-acting antidepressants. In clinical trials, a single intravenous dose of scopolamine produced improvement in depressive symptoms within days, much faster than conventional antidepressants, which take weeks to work. The mechanism is not fully understood, but appears to involve the drug's effects on acetylcholine signaling in brain regions associated with mood regulation. The same drugs can also be weapons. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union researched the use of anticholinergic compounds, including synthetic relatives of atropine and scopolamine, as non-lethal incapacitating agents. The idea was to create a substance that could be dispersed as a gas or aerosol, rendering enemy soldiers confused, disoriented, and unable to fight without actually killing them. A synthetic compound called BZ, or 3-quinaclinylbenzoate, was developed for this purpose. It is a far more potent anticholinergic than atropine, and its effects last for days. Soldiers exposed to BZ would become delirious, unable to distinguish reality from hallucination, incapable of following orders or operating weapons. They would essentially be out of action until the drug wore off, at which point they would recover with no lasting physical damage. Though the psychological impact of having spent days in a waking nightmare could be significant. The use of such weapons is banned under the Chemical Weapons Convention, but research into them revealed much about how anticholinergics affect the brain. The deliriant hallucinations they cause are uniquely disturbing. Unlike psychedelics, which produce visual distortions and alterations in perception while usually allowing the user to maintain some awareness that they are hallucinating, deliriants cause full dissociation from reality. A person under the influence of strong anticholinergic will see people and objects that are not there, will have conversations with entities that do not exist, and will be utterly convinced that these experiences are real. When they emerge from the delirium, they often have only fragmented, confusing memories of what happened. This is why recreational use of nightshade plants is extremely dangerous. People who consume datura or other nightshades, expecting a psychedelic experience, often report that it was the most terrifying episode of their lives. They describe being trapped in a nightmare from which they could not wake, unable to trust their senses, unable to distinguish between what was real and what was hallucination. The experience can last for days, and users have been known to injure themselves or others while in this state, acting on delusions that seemed completely real at the time. Modern toxicology has also revealed just how narrow the margin is between a therapeutic dose and a toxic dose for many tropane alkaloids. This is quantified using the therapeutic index, the ratio between the dose that causes toxic effects and the dose that produces the desired therapeutic effect. For atropine and scopolamine, this index is relatively low, meaning there's not much room for error. A dose that effectively treats bradycardia might be only 2 or 3 times smaller than a dose that causes dangerous tachycardia, hallucinations, and hyperthermia. This is why nightshades remain dangerous even after their active compounds were isolated and understood. The plants themselves have variable alkaloid content depending on where they grow, when they're harvested, how they're stored, and even which part of the plant is used. A tea made from belladonna leaves could be harmless or lethal, depending on factors the person brewing it could not control or measure. Only with the advent of pharmaceutical-grade atropine, produced in controlled facilities with rigorous quality control, did it become safe to use these compounds routinely. The story of nightshade alkaloids is, in many ways, the story of the transition from traditional herbalism to modern pharmacology. The plants were used for thousands of years based on empirical observation and accumulated wisdom. They worked, but they were unpredictable and dangerous. When science finally understood what made them work, it became possible to extract the useful compounds, standardize the doses, and eliminate the variability. The plant's power was harnessed, controlled, and made safe. But even today, with all our understanding of tropane alkaloid chemistry and pharmacology, nightshades retain an element of danger. The plants still grow wild. Children still occasionally eat belladonna berries and require emergency treatment. People still experiment with datura and end up in hospital emergency rooms, terrified and disoriented. And across the world, scopolamine is sometimes used criminally, slipped into drinks to render victims compliant and amnesiac, a modern application of a very old form of chemical power. Modern medicine and the nightshade renaissance. By the mid-20th century, nightshades have been thoroughly domesticated by modern science. Atropine, scopolamine, and related compounds were manufactured in pharmaceutical factories, packaged in standardized doses, and prescribed by doctors who understood their mechanisms of action. The plants themselves, once the source of all this pharmacological power, seemed almost irrelevant, botanical curiosities from a pre-scientific age. But the story did not end there. In fact, it is still being written. Nightshades continue to play a vital role in modern medicine, and new applications are still being discovered. Atropine remains on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, a designation reserved for drugs deemed absolutely necessary for a functioning healthcare system. It is used in emergency medicine to treat certain types of heart rhythm disturbances, particularly dangerous bradycardia, where the heart beats too slowly to maintain adequate blood flow. Paramedics carry atropine in their medical kits. It's one of the drugs that can restart a heart that has slowed to a near stop. Atropine is also a critical antidote for certain types of poisoning. Organophosphate pesticides, widely used in agriculture, and nerve agents like sarin, used in chemical warfare, both work by inhibiting the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. Without this enzyme, acetylcholine accumulates at nerve junctions, overstimulating muscles and glands. The result is a cascade of effects: excessive salivation, sweating, tears, bronchial secretions, muscle twitching, difficulty breathing, and eventually respiratory failure and death. Atropine, by blocking muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, can counteract these effects. Soldiers and militaries around the world are issued autoinjectors containing atropine, designed to be administered quickly if they are exposed to nerve gas. Farmers who work with organophosphate pesticides are advised to have atropine available in case of accidental exposure. The drug that was once used to kill has become essential for saving lives. In ophthalmology, atropine and its relatives remain important, though newer, shorter-acting drugs have largely replaced them for routine eye examinations. However, atropine is still used therapeutically to treat certain eye conditions. In children with amblyopia or lazy eye, atropine drops can be used to temporarily blur vision in the stronger eye, forcing the brain to use the weaker eye and helping to correct the imbalance. After certain types of eye surgery, atropine is used to keep the pupil dilated and the focusing muscles paralyzed, preventing painful spasms and giving the eye time to heal. Scopolamine has found its niche primarily in treating motion sickness. The transdermal patch, placed behind the ear, releases a controlled dose of the drug over several days, preventing nausea and vomiting during sea voyages, flights, or long car trips. It's particularly useful for people who need to function normally while traveling, as it causes less sedation than many other anti-nausea drugs, though it can still cause dry mouth and blurred vision. Research has also explored scopolamine's potential as a rapid-acting antidepressant. In clinical trials, intravenous scopolamine produced measurable improvements in depression scores within hours to days, a striking contrast to conventional antidepressants, which typically require weeks of daily dosing before any effect is seen. The mechanism is not entirely understood, and scopolamine has significant side effects that limit its practical use, but the research has spurred interest in developing safer drugs that work through similar pathways. Beyond atropine and scopolamine, other compounds derived from nightshades have medical applications. Hyoscine butylbromide, a derivative of scopolamine, is used to treat abdominal cramps and spasms. Unlike scopolamine itself, this compound does not cross the blood-brain barrier easily, so it acts primarily in the gut without causing central nervous system effects like sedation or hallucinations. Tropicamide and cyclopentolate, synthetic relatives of atropine, are used in eye drops for dilating pupils during examinations. They work faster than atropine and wear off within hours rather than days, making them more practical for diagnostic purposes. The pharmaceutical industry continues to search for new compounds based on the tropane alkaloid structure. By modifying the molecular framework, chemists can create drugs with more selective receptor binding, fewer side effects, or different durations of action. Some of these synthetic drugs are now far removed from their botanical origins, but they owe their existence to nightshades, to the millions of years of plant evolution that created the original tropane molecules. Nightshades have also contributed to our understanding of neuroscience. By studying how atropine and scopolamine affect the brain, researchers have learned a great deal about the role of acetylcholine in memory, attention, and cognition. Alzheimer's disease, for example, involves a severe depletion of acetylcholine in certain brain regions, leading to memory loss and cognitive decline. Understanding this has led to the development of drugs that increase acetylcholine levels by inhibiting acetylcholinesterase, the enzyme that breaks it down. These drugs do not cure Alzheimer's, but they can slow its progression and improve symptoms in some patients. The relationship between nightshades and medicine has come full circle. Ancient physicians used these plants empirically, observing their effects and developing treatments based on trial and error. Medieval and Renaissance doctors refined these uses, creating increasingly sophisticated preparations. Early modern chemists isolated the active compounds and began to understand their chemistry. And now, contemporary medical researchers use nightshade alkaloids and their synthetic derivatives to probe the fundamental mechanisms of the nervous system, to treat diseases, and to develop entirely new classes of drugs. The plants themselves are still cultivated for pharmaceutical purposes. Belladonna, henbane, and related species are grown on farms in various parts of the world, their leaves harvested and processed to extract alkaloids for use in medicine. It is more economical in many cases to grow the plants and extract the compounds than to synthesize them entirely from scratch. So the relationship between humanity and these plants continues, no longer mystical or fearful, but practical and controlled. Yet the danger has not entirely disappeared. Even today, accidental poisonings occur. Children attracted by the shiny blackberries of belladonna still sometimes eat them, requiring emergency treatment with activated charcoal, intravenous fluids, and supportive care until the alkaloids are metabolized and excreted. Adults experimenting with datura or other nightshades, often found growing wild in temperate regions, end up in emergency rooms experiencing terrifying hallucinations, hyperthermia, and dangerously elevated heart rates. And in some parts of the world, scopolamine is used criminally. In Colombia, there have been reports of criminals using scopolamine, extracted from local brugmansia trees, another nightshade, to render victims compliant and amnesiac. The victim is given the drug, often without their knowledge, and then becomes highly suggestible, willing to hand over valuables or access bank accounts. Afterward, they have little or no memory of what happened. The phenomenon, whether as widespread as sensational media reports suggest or more limited, demonstrates that even in the 21st century, nightshades retain their power to control the mind. Legacy: the forbidden plants in the modern world. We have traveled thousands of years with nightshades, from the ancient Mediterranean to the Renaissance courts of Italy, from the Andean highlands to modern pharmaceutical laboratories. The plants that once grew only in specific regions have spread across the globe. The alkaloids that terrified and fascinated our ancestors are now thoroughly understood at the molecular level. The mystery is gone, replaced by knowledge, precision, and control. And yet, the nightshades have not lost their hold on the human imagination. They still occupy a unique place in our culture, straddling the line between the beneficial and the dangerous, between the mundane and the mystical. Walk through any supermarket and you'll find nightshades everywhere. Tomatoes in a dozen varieties, from cherry to beefsteak. Potatoes, fresh or frozen or processed into chips and fries. Peppers, from sweet bells to fiery habaneros. Eggplants, glossy and purple. These plants, once feared as poisonous invaders from the New World, are now so thoroughly integrated into global cuisine that it is difficult to imagine cooking without them. In your medicine cabinet, you might find eye drops containing a nightshade derivative, used for dry eyes or allergies. If you've ever been seasick and used a patch to prevent nausea, you've applied scopolamine. If you've had certain types of surgery, you were likely given atropine to regulate your heart rate and reduce secretions. Nightshades have saved countless lives, eased immeasurable suffering, and enabled medical procedures that would otherwise be impossible. But step into a different cultural context, and you'll find nightshades still serving darker purposes. In traditional medicine systems that exist alongside modern healthcare in many parts of the world, nightshades are still used in ways that blur the line between healing and hexing. In some cultures, they are still seen as plants of magic, capable of granting visions or communicating with spirits. The knowledge of how to prepare them, how to dose them, is still passed down from elder to student, herbalist to apprentice. In literature and popular culture, nightshades retain their sinister associations. Belladonna appears in murder mysteries and Gothic novels, the poison of choice for a calculating killer. The aesthetic of the poisonous plant, dark and alluring, dangerous and beautiful, continues to fascinate. The witches of Shakespeare's Macbeth brew their infamous potion from ingredients, including nightshade. Modern fantasy and horror draw heavily on nightshade imagery and lore. There is a garden in Alnwick, England, called the Poison Garden, where belladonna, henbane, and other deadly plants are cultivated behind locked gates. Visitors are given tours, warned not to touch anything, and told the stories of how these plants have killed and healed throughout history. It is a tourist attraction, but it also serves as a reminder that some plants are best appreciated from a distance. The question of whether nightshades are gifts or curses has no simple answer. The truth is that they are both, and they are neither. They are plants, products of evolution, producing alkaloids as a defense mechanism against being eaten by insects and herbivores. That these same chemicals happen to interact with human neurotransmitter receptors in ways that can dilate pupils, induce hallucinations, stop hearts, or save lives is a consequence of biochemical coincidence, not intent. Humanity has chosen how to use these plants. We have used them to heal and to harm, to seek visions and to commit murder, to ease suffering and to inflict it. The plants themselves are neutral, but our relationship with them is anything but. It is a relationship defined by fear and desire, by the pursuit of knowledge and the wielding of power, by the hope of curing disease and the willingness to exploit vulnerability. The nightshades teach us, if we are willing to learn, that the natural world is not divided into the safe and the dangerous, the good and the evil. The same plant that kills a child can save an adult. The same molecule that causes delirium can cure disease. Context matters. Dose matters. Knowledge matters. Intent matters. As we stand in the 21st century, with our sophisticated understanding of chemistry and pharmacology, it is easy to feel that we have mastered the nightshades, that we have tamed them and bent them to our will. But every year, somewhere, someone eats belladonna berries thinking they are safe. Someone tries to use datura as a recreational drug and ends up traumatized. Someone in a hospital receives atropine that saves their life. The plants continue to teach us, continue to remind us that power, whether chemical or cultural, must be treated with respect. The complete history of nightshades is not complete. It continues. New medical applications are still being discovered. New varieties of tomatoes and potatoes are still being bred. People are still poisoned, and people are still cured. The plants grow, as they have for millions of years, producing their alkaloids, indifferent to how we classify them or what we call them. They are solanaceae. They are nightshades. They are the plants that grew in the Garden of Hecate and the fields of the Inca. They are the beautiful death and the forbidden fruit. They are the poison and the cure. And they will endure, as they have endured, bearing witness to the long, strange, often tragic, and occasionally triumphant relationship between humanity and the green world that sustains and threatens us in equal measure. We have come to the end of our journey through shadow and history, through gardens of darkness and laboratories of light. The nightshades have revealed their secrets, at least the secrets that science can uncover. But some mysteries remain, not in the plants themselves, but in how we continue to relate to them, how we continue to fear and desire them, how they continue to shape our world in ways both visible and hidden. If you found this exploration of the forbidden plants valuable, if you learned something about the deep and tangled history connecting us to these remarkable organisms, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support makes it possible to continue diving into these long, dark, fascinating stories that history so often overlooks or sanitizes. Let me know in the comments what topic you'd like to explore next. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and remember that the most powerful forces in history are often the ones we cannot see.